Welcome everyone to another one of our lectures in the lecture series Illicit Objects, Lived Religion, that is part of the Center for the Study of Lived Religion at Ca' Foscari University of Venice. I'm Joseph Sanzo, and I'm the director of the center. We are very pleased to have a presentation today by Joseph Calabrese, who is a reader of medical anthropology at UCL, a medical and psychological anthropologist and UK registered clinical psychologist. He holds a PhD from the University of Chicago's Interdisciplinary Committee on Human Development, where he combines study of anthropology with training in development and clinical psychology. His anthropological monograph, A Different Medicine, Postcolonial Healing in the Native American Church, explores a ritual-based postcolonial healing movement centered on the use of the psychedelic peyote cactus. Calabrese studied community and family-based use and the incorporation of the Peyote Ceremony into clinical programs serving Native Americans, including one in which he treated patients for a year as a volunteer. His current research focuses on mental illness and psychiatric care in the Kingdom of Bhutan in South Asia. And today he'll be delivering a presentation titled An Illicit Path to Postcolonial Healing. Joseph, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. Very nice to be here with you today, and I'm going to discuss my field research with Native Americans and my understanding of the peyote cactus as an illicit medicine. It's a very interesting topic you're exploring of illicit objects in religion. And had an enduring interest in Native American mental health and traditional therapeutic methods. And during my doctoral studies, I became especially interested in a post-colonial healing tradition among Native Americans called the Native American Church. The therapeutic approach was under attack in a U.S. Supreme Court case called Oregon v. Smith due to the nature of its healing rituals. The Supreme Court's decision in this case was that followers of the Native American Church, which had previously been protected by the Free Exercise Clause of the U.S. Constitution, could now be found guilty of a felony due to their use of the psychedelic peyote cactus. Psychedelics are naturally occurring substances that produce profoundly altered experiences of self and world, often interpreted spiritually by indigenous societies as visions or communications from God or from other divinities. And these substances have been used for religious and therapeutic purposes throughout human history. Digging deeper into this Native American tradition led me to discover an enduring clash of cultural paradigms related to peyote use that spanned centuries. And I'll focus on this clash, which rendered peyote an illicit sacrament. To understand this therapeutic approach, I argue that we need to understand the history that led to its formation. The European conquest and colonization of the Americas has been called the greatest genocide in human history, with as many as 100 million indigenous people dying as a result of European diseases and warfare, often following explicit policies of cultural destruction. After the arrival of the Spanish, and throughout the Mexican Inquisition, torture, incarceration, public humiliation, and burning at the stake were used to enforce a Spanish Catholic vision of the normal and the sacred. And it's in this context that Europeans formed their first opinions of the peyote cactus. Archaeological findings indicate that Native Americans have used the cactus for over 6 millennia. In fact, the oldest findings are within the United States in the state of Texas. However, the Spanish saw peyote as a strange heathen substance and assumed that it was used in rituals to contact evil spirits. And the Inquisition created the first Euro-American anti-drug law in 1620 by proclaiming peyote the work of the devil. And this was followed by many government-sanctioned witch hunts. Records of an anti-peyotist Inquisition hearing held in Santa Fe in 1632 reveal the antiquity of this culture clash in the area now occupied by the United States. The arrival of Europeans in the New World triggered a clash of cultural paradigms surrounding indigenous use of peyote that has extended for centuries. What indigenous people saw as revelatory and therapeutic sacred experiences, the European Christians denounced as something unholy and damaging. And thus, Euro-American anti-drug policy had its beginnings in an ethnocentric and xenophobic reaction, reflecting Christian religious convictions and purity doctrines rather than an impartial assessment of the evidence, and often motivated by an explicit desire to destroy indigenous ways of life. For example, the late 19th century Code of Indian Offenses restricted indigenous religious and cultural practices generally to speed assimilation. Later, Euro-American policies against peyote shifted to a legal rationalization, punishment of crime, and away from the overt spiritual language of the Inquisition focused on superstition and heresy. But the largely unquestioned ethnocentrism of these policies remained. And it's crucial to note that the Europeans were not simply against the idea of psychoactive substances, they brought their own sacred psychoactive substance, alcoholic beverages, which in the form of wine is at the heart of Christian ritual. However, it was alcohol, the Europeans' ritual sacrament, and not peyote, which turned out to be uniquely dangerous and damaging for indigenous populations. Indigenous tribes in North America had no norms, ideologies, or rituals for the safe use of potent alcoholic beverages. Alcoholism, alongside disease, outright violence, and marginalization, exacerbated community disintegration and postcolonial forms of disorder. The Native American societies that survived all these events were traumatized by the violent conquest, death of loved ones, loss of their lands, and forced acculturation. And today, Native Americans face health problems and social disorder that are, compared with many other groups in the United States, uniquely severe. These include elevated rates of death from alcoholism, suicide, homicide, unintentional injuries, tuberculosis, and diabetes. There were various attempts at cultural revitalization and self-healing among Native American communities. In the ghost dance, Native Americans prayed for the resurrection of their dead, the return of the previous ways of life, the return of the bison and other game animals, and the disappearance of Europeans from the land. This movement spread in the late 1800s, bringing various Western tribes together, including former enemies. However, the U.S. Army interpreted the movement as a prelude to war, and the practitioners of the ghost dance were crushed by the Army in 1890 at Wounded Knee on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, in a mass killing of men, women, and children. The ghost dance then declined, or at least went underground. However, the friendly intertribal contacts that it helped to create remained. This set the stage for the spread of another major intertribal revitalization movement, the Native American Church, which was first described in the late 19th century. Instead of focusing on a transformation of the world through the disappearance of Europeans, it focused on personal transformation that would allow one to survive in the post-conquest situation, build stronger communities, and avoid forms of post-colonial disorder like addiction to white man's alcohol, which was ravaging indigenous communities. This personal transformation was achieved through the ritual consumption of a sacred and ancient Native American medicine that was seen as powerful enough to defeat alcohol, the psychoactive peyote cactus. The Native American church took hold, spreading from Plains tribes in Oklahoma to many tribes throughout the United States and Canada, and it's now the most widespread Native North American religion. During my 2 years of field work among the Navajos, I observed the context in which the use of this psychedelic plant is the glue of family life, shared in family rituals, and incorporated into federally funded clinical programs serving Native Americans. This tradition became the topic of my doctoral thesis and my first book. I approached this tradition using the two disciplines in which I'm trained, anthropology and clinical psychology. Following an approach I call embedded clinical ethnography, my field research combined 2 years of immersive participant observation in Navajo communities with a concurrent year of volunteer clinical practice at a Navajo-run treatment program. This component immersed me in Native American clinical problems and experiences of suffering, as well as in the local treatment community working alongside Native American therapists. I did interviews and observation, but I also learned about practices through doing them and reflecting on the experience, including attending a variety of healing ceremonies, including peyote ceremonies, treating patients, and forming long-term relationships with Native American healers and others in the community. The Navajo Nation comprises a large area of semi-arid land in the states of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah. I started my research by spending several summers living with a rural Native American church family in an isolated area where many of the older people didn't speak any English, herding their 150 sheep and goats in exchange for meals and a cot in the hogan, which is the circular log cabin that is the traditional Navajo dwelling. This work gave me an experiential understanding of the lives of contemporary Native American church members living in a very traditional context. I also attended the family's healing rituals, both traditional Navajo and NAC, when someone was ill. A central component of my interdisciplinary approach to ethnography is what I call dialectical challenge. In approaching complex human phenomena, I systematically seek a dialectical understanding that evaluates and synthesizes opposed perspectives. So I challenge Euro-American assumptions and approaches with investigation of contrasting cultures. And I also challenge anthropological perspectives with clinical psychological perspectives and vice versa, because each academic discipline has its blind spots. I also seek to challenge ethnographic experiences with contrasting ethnographic experiences. For example, in relation to my evolving relativist view of Native American peyote use after my first summer living with a Navajo family, I deliberately sought immersion in contexts which could challenge and possibly disconfirm the relativist view. This included training at the University of Chicago in diagnosis and treatment of substance abuse disorders, and incorporating clinical practice with patients, including Native Americans, having very real problems with addiction and substance abuse. I think of this pattern of dialectical challenge as doing counter-ethnography, which enables a nuanced and a complex experiential understanding of the phenomenon. My field project culminated in a full year combining fieldwork with full-time clinical practice at a U.S. government-funded and accredited treatment facility for dually diagnosed adolescents, administered by the Navajo tribe and run by a Native American healer affiliated with the Native American Church. This program, which was on the grounds of this Indian Health Service hospital, was a residential treatment program for Native American adolescents with severe substance abuse and mental illness problems. It incorporated modern clinical and traditional tribal traditions of intervention into an approach that was responsive to the unique backgrounds of particular patients who were from various tribes across the United States. Cases at the facility tended to be very severe. I treated patients with PTSD, suicide attempts, cutting, and other forms of self-harm on top of alcoholism, inhalant abuse, and crystal meth. And in this case, my evolving relativist position on Native American peyote use survived the dialectical challenge because I looked for but found no cases of peyote abuse among Native American adolescents that we treated. And the NAC seemed to be helping many people at all ages to avoid alcohol. My local clinical work revealed many things, including the usefulness of indigenous methods in this context, and sometimes the irrelevance of modern approaches that were said to be empirically validated. Even an element of clinical practice as mundane as intake forms could reveal the centuries-old culture clash. So the consent form for spiritual participation was an interesting intake document that asked parents to identify which spiritual treatment options their adolescent child could be exposed to from the following list: NAC, traditional Navajo practices or ceremonies, sweat lodge, or Christian domination, please specify. And I realized immediately what a beautiful Freudian slip I had encountered. Instead of Christian denomination, the form said Christian domination, echoing the colonial history. However, the form also demonstrated how ritual treatment was individualized to meet the needs of particular clients from different backgrounds, peyotist and non-peyotist or Christian. Local clinical practice also revealed the ironic fact that the same U.S. government that includes peyote on its Schedule 1, listing dangerous substances with no therapeutic uses, also codes the peyote ceremony as a valid therapeutic intervention for substance abuse. As I discovered, therapeutic use of peyote had its own Indian Health Service client service code, which is used for reporting provision of clinical services to the Indian Health Service for reimbursement. In fact, during my year working at this Navajo-run clinical facility, I followed standard clinical practice in writing the peyote ceremony and other ritual modalities into my treatment and aftercare plans for the adolescents I was treating. I was seeing therapeutic changes occurring in rituals and continuing resilience and sobriety associated with membership of the Native American Church. Seeking independent clarification on the outcomes I was observing, I helped a psychiatrist colleague from Harvard set up an independent study of mental health outcomes of Native American church members. The study compared mental health and neuropsychological test results of a group of Navajos who regularly used peyote and a group reporting minimal use of peyote, alcohol, or other substances. Results indicated that the peyote group showed no significant differences from the abstinent comparison group on most scales, but they scored significantly better on 2 scales of the RAND mental health inventory. Furthermore, among NAC members, greater lifetime peyote use was associated with significantly better RAND scores on 5 of the 9 scales, including the composite mental health index. So the therapeutic effect of peyote is strongly supported by the U.S. government's coding and reimbursement of the ritual as treatment, the finding published in biological psychiatry that more lifetime participation results in higher mental health scores, and also my own immersive experience as a clinician writing these rituals into my treatment and aftercare plans and seeing therapeutic results. In what remains of the talk, I'll discuss why I think this intervention works and I'll share my anthropological and psychological analysis of the therapeutic process of the Native American Church. I'll then interpret its clash with Euro-American norms and its repeated criminalization. I came to understand the NAC's therapeutic efficacy in terms of a process of emplotment. The term emplotment, which I picked up from the Harvard medical anthropologists, refers to the act of placing events or people into a story, expressing a particular plot structure or narrative framing. Therapeutic emplotment involves plot structures that have intended or actual therapeutic effects. An important aspect of my own use of the term is that I argue that the structure of culture also emplots in ways that are not so much negotiated in each situation, but rather preordained by tradition. I've used the term culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment to refer to the ways in which narrative structures that reflect human therapeutic intentions help form the very fabric of cultural meaning, are transmitted via enculturation, and are employed in situations of therapeutic intervention in ways that are pre-structured delivery of packages of symbolism and narrative, basically. From this perspective, I argue that therapeutic emplotment also functions in large-scale cultural and religious phenomena, including the Christian narrative that we're all saved by Christ's sacrifice and can get to heaven, or the Hindu-Buddhist narrative of karma that claims the universe is just and beings will be punished or rewarded in the next life for their actions in this one. These worldviews are, in my view, therapeutic emplotments embedded in the fabric of culture and acting as an omnipresent form of cognitive therapy that impacts self and emotional orientation and social functioning. So this concept of culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment is central to my theory of culture and religion and to my understanding of therapeutic intervention. I see this emplotment process operating at two levels in the Native American Church, one more broad and pervasive, and the other more situational. At the first and most basic level, there's a broad, culturally embedded emplotment that's delivered via enculturation. I call this level worldview formation. NAC members are taught that peyote is a sacred medicine sent to them by the divine, which allows communication with the divine. The cactus is a conduit, but it also has a spirit with powers of its own, which include consciousness and omniscience, or being all-seeing. Children are taught that once they've partaken of the sacrament, even in the small sacramental taste of peyote that children are given, the peyote spirit will know their actions going forward and may give them trouble if they break important taboos, foremost of which is drinking alcohol. If NAC socialization is successful, the omnipresent gaze of the peyote spirit will become a constant companion of the young peyotist, preventing the child from alcohol consumption and other sins, even when the parents are absent. The peyote spirit is thus a sort of surrogate parent, and in fact it's conventionally referred to as Mother Peyote or Father Peyote. I refer to the process of worldview formation here as panoptical enculturation, because it creates a panoptical gaze perceived by the NAC member, leading to self-discipline in the same way Foucault discussed, drawing on Bentham's design for the perfect present, where the watcher is invisible, so you never know when you're being monitored. Among children, the peyote spirit can act as an invisible but omnipresent guardian, keeping kids under control and safe if they internalize the sense of always being watched and regulate their own behavior accordingly. I understand the omniscient presence of peyote as a therapeutic plot structure instilled in enculturation that shapes experience and is aimed at securing healthy and moral behavior, including prevention of damaging alcohol use. In relation to peyote, these kids were taught the familiar parental formula. It knows if you've been good or bad, and makes its gaze known through visions, voices, and other sorts of communications, interpreted as warnings or revelations about the self. And children are also taught the adage peyote and alcohol don't mix. Alcohol is framed as the central sin of the religion. The process of panoptical enculturation is exemplified in this account by a teenage member who had a rebellious phase in which he stopped taking peyote with his parents and instead engaged in drinking parties with peers. He told me, I grew up in a Native American church family and attended since I was small. At 5 or 7 or something, that's when I started eating peyote. I just used to take it in a holy way and never took too much. Then from 15 on, that I started kind of going crazy and getting into peer pressure, stopped going to meetings with my dad and started going to parties. And then when I took it, when I was drinking, I took a whole bunch of peyote and it showed me how bad I was doing. Right now, it knows me, it knows who I am. So much effort goes into the emplotment of peyote as an effective medicine and as an omniscient and morally evaluative spiritual companion. However, I found among adult NAC members, there were often differences of opinion about the personhood of peyote, with some believing in the existence of the peyote spirit, some telling me they didn't believe but used the word spirit because it provided something tangible for the mind to grasp. Others telling me that referring to the cactus as Mother Peyote or Father Peyote is a customary way to show respect, and others telling me they think of peyote simply as a medicinal herb. The second, more situational mode of emplotment takes place when a healing ritual is called for a member of the community. A ritual enclosure, usually a teepee, is prepared with a central altar of earth made in the shape of a half moon. A line is sketched along the top called the road, the path of one's life, beginning at birth on the left side, rising to its highest potency in adulthood, and then decreasing in potency as one approaches old age and death, similar to the arc of the sun traveling across the sky. So the moon symbol functions on one level as a symbol of one's life, implying a process of critical self-reflection during the ritual. Another set of local interpretations depict the moon as a symbol of transformation, because the moon changes by waxing and waning, and the natural process of gestation that produces human life is counted by moons or months. So, just in this single ritual symbol, self is symbolically embedded in transformation. The multiple meanings of the moon weave a plot structure involving the transformative regestation of the self. And similarly, the teepee, I was told, represents a pregnant woman with a blanket facing east, and the beating of the peyote drum throughout the night replicates the sound of a mother's heartbeat as heard from within the womb. The ritual culminates at dawn when the participants emerge from the teepee and greet the new day in a symbolic rebirth from the maternal teepee. Thus, the timing of the ritual reinforces the emplotment. The ritual begins at the ending of a day, moves the patient symbolically to the dawn of a new day, accompanied by many symbols of rebirth and renewal. Healing experiences then often mirror this symbolism, taking the form of personal transformation. My best friend and teacher among the Navajos, Hosky, who went blind as a young man, shared his experience of being healed in a peyote ceremony. He recounted how he experienced depression and alcohol abuse after he lost his sight, but was brought to a peyote ceremony where he experienced what he called a vision or a dream. He and his friends were drinking, and he remembers seeing the can of beer shining in the moonlight. The party was suddenly disrupted by two gunshots, and then the vision showed Hosky a graveyard, and the voice warned him, if you don't decide one way or another, this is where you're headed. You can't play with this. echoing the adage that peyote and alcohol don't mix. Note that in this vision we have some of the primary features of the ritual symbolism and the broader culturally embedded therapeutic emplotment: the presence of the moon, the omniscient voice of peyote, reflection on one's path of life, and a death and rebirth experience. Hosky told me that this vision turned his life around, allowing him to give up alcohol and seek recovery. And his healing was long lasting and consisted of his coming to terms with his ongoing disability. Not only did he become sober, he went on to become a very influential peyotist healer, and he was the CEO of the Navajo-run treatment facility at which I worked during my field research. In Hosky's case, we can see how the state of transformative self-reflection, reinforced by ritual symbolism and peyote ingestion, structured a vision which triggered therapeutic insight and behavior change. I see the use of the psychedelic peyote cactus in this context as serving the goals of emplotment in several ways. Not only does peyote trigger personally meaningful visionary experiences and states of intense self-reflection on one's life path, but experimental research finds that psychedelics, including peyote's psychoactive ingredient mescaline, enhance suggestibility levels similar to a hypnotic induction. Thus, in the peyote ceremony, the therapeutic emplotment embedded in the symbolic ritual structure, emphasizing insight and personal transformation, appears to be installed in the mind as a post-hypnotic suggestion, bypassing psychological defenses and imbuing the symbols and experiences with immense, mysterious psychological power. Psychopharmacological substances in the service of therapeutic emplotment, guiding personal ritual experiences in socially desired directions is what's happening. Realizations one has in the ritual, often in the form of visions which depict the person's sins or provide warnings or reassurance, impact the NAC member and contribute to greater insight and behavioral self-control. This is a very different understanding of psychopharmacology than we find in mainstream Euro-American psychiatry, which typically provides pharmacological intervention without a lot of work on the patient's meaningful interpretation of the intervention. The dominant materialist agonist-antagonist paradigm of Euro-American psychiatry focuses on fixing discrete neurochemical imbalances within a mechanistic medical model. In my view, the peyote ceremony represents an entirely different paradigm of psychopharmacological intervention, one focused on higher order mental processes like experience, emotion, insight, creativity, and planning, going beyond the synapse and the neurotransmitter to the level of meaning, emplotment, and social interaction. I refer to this as a semiotic reflexive paradigm of psychopharmacology, as opposed to the materialist agonist-antagonist model of mainstream psychiatry. This is a deep cultural difference that goes beyond different metaphysical suppositions or cultural framings and reveals distinctive indigenous psychotherapeutic knowledge and skill. Though it's a contrasting psychiatric paradigm, it still resonates with what I've learned about clinical use of hypnosis, therapeutic metaphors, and cognitive restructuring from my clinical training. A distinctive feature is the integration of narrative framing or emplotment into the pharmacological intervention. Modern mental health care separates the pharmacological and meaning-related approaches into separate disciplines, psychiatry and clinical psychology. And this results in psychiatric medicines being administered with little effort devoted to emplotting their use in a meaningful way. In contrast, within Native American contexts that are not dualist in the same way, psychoactive plant medicines are used specifically to transform self-awareness and enhance emplotment in a narrative, including via the pharmacological enhancement of suggestibility. The healing ritual embeds the participants in a plot structure of gestation and rebirth, often triggering life-changing visions or healing experiences involving a self-implantment in line with ritual symbolism, and this process is enhanced by the peyote cactus. However, this form of pharmacological intervention to facilitate creative shifts in perspective, therapeutic implantment, or insight has been alien to the standard usage of psychiatric medicines in Euro-American psychiatry, so the NAC's therapeutic approach is rendered invisible and was mistaken for drug abuse or, in an earlier era, devil worship. So how did peyote become illicit? Overall, what stands out as a research finding is a centuries-old clash of cultural paradigms related to proper religious practice, family life, child rearing, states of consciousness, and pharmacology. I found the NAC to be pro-family and pro-community, and more about effectively navigating the larger society rather than simply rejecting it, as the Ghost Dance did. For example, early on, Native Americans who used peyote started calling themselves a church, using the Euro-American concept to better fit into the Christianity-based tradition of religious tolerance that is constitutionally protected in the United States. Some peyotist communities also incorporated Christian symbolism and mythology, creating a blend of Christianity and indigenous spirituality. One might ask why Native Americans continued to use peyote even in the face of attacks. In my view, and in terms of my analysis I've shared, eliminating the peyote would eliminate a central structural component of the therapeutic process that they developed, which is one of the very few effective therapeutic interventions and paths to a productive life in this population. As a clinician, considering the severe adolescent cases I treated, I often thought that a powerfully transformative religious experience might be the only thing sufficiently impactful to change severe substance abuse and other high-risk behaviors. Anthropology shows us there are multiple viable paths of life and paths of human development. Both the indigenous and the Euro-American ways of life are viable, but take very different forms. However, limited by their own cultural paradigms and purity doctrines, which they assumed were the only true ones, Europeans in North America have misunderstood and criminalized indigenous practices in a way that has been unnecessarily ethnocentric. As the anthropologist Mary Douglas emphasized, phenomena that simply fall outside familiar cultural categories tend to be seen as dangerous or defiling in many cultures. We see this when modern governments tolerate the most damaging substances, alcohol and tobacco, because they fit into familiar cultural categories of the dominant societies, and these legal substances are responsible for several million deaths each year. At the same time, governments demonize and criminalize psychoactive plants characteristic of other cultural groups, even when they're demonstrably less harmful than the culturally familiar options and may even be therapeutic. In both situations, an ethnocentric purity doctrine is followed. It's interesting to note that at times, peyote was even outlawed by the Navajo tribe because it was seen as a foreign influence from another group of tribes, mostly from the plains. The elderly Navajo peyotist medicine man, whose family I lived with and herded sheep for, was jailed by the tribe for his involvement early on. Given the clash of very different cultures, peyote became an illicit object, one producing illicit experiential states. However, when the ethnocentrism is bracketed, an entire functioning cultural psychiatric system becomes visible. An alternate system of pharmacological psychiatry existing within the United States alongside the pharmaceuticals industry, big alcohol, big tobacco, and the war on drugs. Among the Native American church members with whom I lived and worked, a psychedelic plant was the glue holding families and communities together. Beyond that, I was surprised to discover that it was also coded and reimbursed by the U.S. government and bureaucratized in the treatment process of an accredited clinical facility. However, when I returned to Chicago from my fieldwork, I re-entered a cultural context in which mere possession of this plant and similar, even weaker psychoactive plants responsible for virtually no deaths could get one arrested and imprisoned. Something I had come to know as a safe and clinically effective plant when used properly and even paid for by the U.S. government would be treated in terms of sentencing as a crime on par with murder or rape. I began to see a situation of purity doctrine clash, since once again the NAC itself supports a purity doctrine outlawing alcohol. So overall, my findings support a critical argument on the ethnocentrism of Euro-American assumptions, and most importantly, I argue in the case of conquered indigenous groups who are attempting to heal themselves after a genocidal onslaught, interference by the conquering power in one of the few effective locally produced therapeutic interventions can be seen as an element of continuing colonial domination and cultural destruction. We should at least let these people heal themselves and their communities in ways they find most useful. So, thank you very much. And for a complete story, please see my book, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Joseph, for that wonderful presentation. So I'll leave the floor open for questions, comments, discussion. Does anybody have any questions? I'll go ahead and start with a question, Joseph.
Great.
So this is very far afield from what I study, but I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the preparation of the peyote and who's doing it, how is it being cultivated, and then perhaps reflecting on maybe what would be the broader implications if, let's say, peyote usage was seen as a broader therapeutic for people, let's say, outside of the community, and what other actors might get involved, certain industries, etc., that would then produce the peyote and perhaps have a different way of spreading it, selling it, etc., a totally different approach in that.
Uh-huh. Yeah. So peyote grows in this small region on the border between Texas and Mexico, and it's a very slow growing cactus, so it takes a long time to grow. And North American Native American church members often make pilgrimage down to the peyote fields to gather peyote, or sometimes it can be shipped by the farms, and the farming was done in a very traditional way where they chop the top off of the cactus without pulling the roots out so that it could more quickly grow back. And these are the peyote buttons that people use. They either chew the button or powder it. Sometimes they steep it in water to achieve a kind of an oatmeal consistency. And I found that to be the easiest way to take peyote. I found the most difficult way when they made it into a tea. And often the grandmothers of the house would, make this as a sort of a home remedy for various ills in the family. But it makes me extremely nauseous quickly. The tea, especially the oatmeal the green oatmeal is not that bad. Now, because it's so slow growing, my attitude is probably it should be reserved for the Native American population, whereas you could achieve similar therapeutic effects from psilocybin mushrooms, which are very rapidly grown. So that's kind of my opinion on it. But if they found a way to grow the cactus, en masse, that could conceivably work, but I'm sure many Native Americans would be upset by broader use among non-indigenous people.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
Other questions or comments? Yes, Christina.
Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very interesting. I was wondering whether there is a kind of age restriction in the use of the cactus, and whether it's also used externally. So do they only consume it, or does it have an external use? So I have these two questions.
When you say externally, do you mean used on wounds and things like that?
Yeah, exactly. Like
Uh-huh.
on the skin or on wounds.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I believe there is a history of using it as a poultice for wounds. I mean, really, you're dealing with um, it could be referred to as a panacea in the way it's understood because it has this holy power and is believed to be good for any kind of ailment in that it sets the spiritual component of the ailment right, and it has, it's kind of seen as being put on the earth for Native Americans to help them heal from colonialism, basically. Um, the age restriction, I found that they gave it to rather young children, but in very low dose, sometimes 3, 4 years old. And the reasoning, it seemed, was to establish this bond between the child and the guardian spirit, the peyote spirit, so that once that it is really a sacrament. Once you consume even a tiny token amount, now you're linked with this spirit who now will watch you and may guide you and may even take revenge on you if you break important taboos. So that's a way I see. It used to be that the children would stay in the homestead with the parents, but nowadays the children are often away from the parents. For example, the family who were herding sheep out in the rural area of the reservation didn't have a high school near them. So the children had to go away for long periods of time to another part of the reservation to go to school. They were away from the parents, and the parents worried about whether they would succumb to alcohol use temptations. So they would have, special rituals to pray for the children to be safe away from the parents, and they would try to instill this belief in the peyote spirit, which can be anywhere and watch them even if they're away from the family.
Thank you.
Hmm.
Thank you. I would like,
Yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I have different questions, but I would like to relate it to this last one because I think that is very, very interesting, your presentation, as it outlines the multiple levels of the illicit, let's say, because there
Mm.
is the colonial dimension, there is the state dimension, there is the medical dimension, and there is also the relational dimension. That is the fact that the plant also has its own agency and its own role in telling people and like teenagers or children what is right and what is wrong.
Hmm.
So there are different and even contrasting voices in what is the licit and the illicit, starting
Hmm.
from alcohol. And I think it is, and this is a first question, then I have also another one. But yeah, like this idea of the plant as also an actor that is active really in telling what people can um, what is right or wrong. Let's say it's not maybe in terms of the illicit, but in terms also of morality and ethical, the ethical dimension of the community in a certain way.
Hmm. Yeah,
Well,
I think,
yeah,
I'm sorry, did you finish? Yeah.
no, please, yeah.
So I think yeah, it is there are various levels as you say, going from there are various phases of it being illicit, starting with being illicit for purely religious purposes, and then that kind of morphing into more of a rationale for their you know using it as a substance, like substance abuse, like they compared it to whiskey, that they would get drunk on it in their rituals, and then later it became just assumed that any non-familiar substances to Euro Americans would be dangerous. Even though alcoholism and tobacco kill about 500,000 in the U.S. alone, and multiple millions each year around the world. So yeah, that's going on, and then, as you say, they created their own sort of purity doctrine, making alcohol taboo or illicit, and that was a way in which they could get a hold of life in this new situation, and forge, many of the more traditionalist Native Americans would think, why do I need to be well adjusted in this post-colonial situation? That seems like a non-authentic way of being. So maybe it takes this radical transformative experience with the psychedelic to now even want to be well adjusted, and have grow your family and community and be mentally healthy in the post-colonial situation. It's almost a radical reorientation to wellness that takes place by the transformative ability of the peyote, the personhood of the peyote, especially for younger people, and this ban on alcohol and other non-peyote substances.
Thank you very much.
Mhm.
I have also another question, but if somebody else has a question, okay, I go. Yeah, so another question that I have is related to, let's say, the role of biomedicine in shaping, at the time of your research, in shaping the process, the regulatory process that allowed then the use of peyote. And in formulating this question, clearly I have in mind, let's say, the broader field of psychedelics
Mhm.
and ayahuasca, right? Because the dialogue or the dynamic between ritual practices, religion, and medicine are clearly quite complex, and the so-called psychedelic renaissance has also all the pharmaceutical industry in that,
Mhm.
and the world of the state. And I think that what people can do or not, like the illicit, is also shaped by, for example, the protocols, the way that then in different countries it is decided how you can use substances or not, and which form. So I don't know if this was also part of the way that the Native American church developed. And so in which way people can, for example, possess peyote, or in which moment, or exactly, as Christina said, like from what age. These kind of aspects are at the bottom, yeah, of my question.
Uh-huh. I think how I see the standard way that substances are dealt with in Western democratic societies is either, you ban them, or there's, unsupervised use in unlimited amounts by anybody who can get their hands on it. So there's a pub on every corner in Britain, pretty much, and you can have as much alcohol as they'll feed you and then go to another pub, right? Whereas with Native Americans, it's very different in that um, it's constrained by norms, rituals, and and all these particular rules that make it safe to use. I mean, from going from the rule that in the teepee, no sharp objects, no knives or forks, just spoons, to the rule that you maintain your focus on the central altar so that you're not looking around, kind of getting paranoid, looking at somebody else, exchanging glances, and the explanation that peyote, even if it gives you a bad trip, that it's always meant to teach you something, so that your focus should be on finding the lesson in it. All these things can, I think, let us achieve safe usage. In the more Euro-American biomedical context of psychedelic therapy, I think the better programs, in my opinion, are the ones that uh, where it's less medicalized and more gives more time and space for the person to reflect and to be in a a holding environment that's been prepared for them, that their expectations have been shaped in advance of the experience in positive directions. They have suitable people monitoring them and guiding them, etc. So I'm not convinced that it's beneficial to just have it available for unsupervised mass recreational usage. And then the role of biomedicine would just be to make sure that the contexts are not abusing patients, or economically, etc., and that the substances themselves are of sufficient good quality, etc. Yeah, I don't know if that entirely answered your question, but that's what it makes me think about.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I want to thank everyone for being here, and especially Joseph for a wonderful presentation. We will see you at the next session, hopefully, which is next Thursday. And yes,
Let me share.
And
I'll
share the link. But again,
Yeah.
thank you, Joseph, for a wonderful presentation and discussion. And I hope to see everybody else at our next session.
Oh, you're very welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joseph, for this wonderful presentation. And yeah, this is our next event next week.
Great.
Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Okay, bye.